Hello you beautiful people, I'm Nicole and today you and I are going to take a deep dive into the Meshlicious case from SSUPD. So this Mini-ITX case has been much anticipated since its reveal late last year, and we're really excited to have one in our hands and see exactly how this case does perform in the small form factor space. At just 14.6 liters, this case is towering at 245mm in length, 167mm in width and just 360mm tall. Using the word towering really isn't the most appropriate choice of word, but this is designed as a vertical case nonetheless, which is really awesome since it is going to take on a much smaller footprint on your desk. The Meshlicious is available in black or white. I personally prefer the black mesh as I'm not quite sure about the maintenance aspect of the white mesh. And also notably, the Meshlicious is literally mesh all around, as you can see here, on all four sides, which I simply adore. I've got to show it to you because it's just so small that I could just lift it all around. Now you would have seen some reviews of the Meshlicious with glass panels, and that is correct. This case is available for sale with a single tempered glass side panel or full mesh side panels. Alternatively, you have the option of purchasing additional mesh side panels or additional tempered glass side panels so that you have the option of swapping. And for the tempered glass, they do have the added variation of dark tinted mirror glass panels as well. So compared to the NR200, the mesh on the panels are so fine, the holes are just so small that if you have RGB in your system on the inside, you will still be able to showcase, which is why you can see through everything just like that, right? So the mesh panels are 1mm thick and they are solid quality. Unlike the NR200, they are not removable mesh added on the panels, but they are the panel itself. This is totally fine by me. They can be cleaned either way. Adding further mesh to this case will just impede the breathability of this case, which defeats the purpose. Moving on the top of the case, you have the Type-C 3.1 Gen 2 port, the power button with LED, and the USB 3.0 port. So unlike many PC cases, the Meshlicious does not have a headset jack on the top of the case, which means your headphones will have to be connected to the headphone jack at the back of the case. Something to note. So in the coming months, I believe we will see more and more of such small form factor cases surfacing in the market. What the Meshlicious did well in this design, apart from being so breathable, is also in the ease of assembly and thereafter accessibility. And what do I mean by that? Packing so much into such a tiny setup and being able to do it without having to struggle to find a spot for your screwdriver is important. Being able to access inside the case each time without having to reach for tools is important. And then especially having so much mesh means dust and all that. Being able to access all the components easily without dread, without challenges, so that you can clean your PC as regularly as you need to is very important. And the Meshlicious, it comes with these toolless push pins. I wouldn't even call it push pins. Basically, you push and it comes off. And then you push and it comes off. And it happens for all the panels, right? Just all the panels. And it does the same. And the amazing thing is, it does the same to put it back. So I can't see on the other side. So it is the same just to put it back. And the ease of doing so just makes it, it's just so important that each time you want to reach for something, you just pull it and it comes off. And that's what I meant by, the ease of access is very important in the design, right? And stripped clear of that, you have full access to all your components in your PC, right? On the front, on the back, every part. And you're just left with the spine. And this kind of accessibility is really, really good, really, really great, in fact. And the way I see it, it should be a minimum standard for all PC cases going forward. And now that we're here, let's take a deeper look inside this case, section by section, and discuss compatibility. So this case is really simple, and this assembly is really just toolhouse of the case of how we're going to build things into, and that's how we're going to focus. So it's in the skeleton, this half and this half. I could move things really in slow motion and zoom in, but let's just zoom it in for you. So on this side of the case, we will have the motherboard and the power supply. For motherboard, this case supports only Mini-ITX motherboard, which is expected. The motherboard sits up here, and that should give you a clear access to plug in all those cables later on. The case comes with a PCIe 3.0 riser cable, as you see here. It is 14.5 centimeters long. If you have a motherboard that supports a PCIe 4.0 and you want to use a riser cable on your newer GPUs that work on a PCIe 4.0, all you need to do is to update your motherboard BIOS to the latest version and update the PCIe configuration in the BIOS to Gen 3. Alternatively, SSUPD does include an option to upgrade to a PCIe 4.0 riser cable that's produced by LinkUp, which is tested to be compatible with NVIDIA's RTX 3000 series GPUs, AMD RX 6000 series GPUs, and AMD X570 motherboards. For power supply, this case supports both ATX and SFX power supplies. So if you are upgrading from an existing build, you can save some money from the power supply. However, to note that if you are using an SFX power supply, you will get a lot more room for cable management, and the power supply cables are going to be shorter. This bracket here is pre-installed. You can just remove it if you're going to be using an ATX power supply. So for storage drives, this is a little bit of a tricky part. So if we turn the case around, this is the opposite side from where the motherboard and the power supply is. Right, this is where we will have the graphics card. There are two options of storage drives, and it basically depends on what kind of graphic cards you're going to be using. So if you are going to be mounting a short GPU horizontally across this section, so in case you are a little bit confused, it is this section horizontally, then there is an included storage bracket which you can install at the bottom, right, just below the horizontal short GPU area. And that bracket can support two 3.5-inch storage drive or four 2.5-inch storage drive. So this is option one, right, if you're going to go for a short GPU. That said, if you're going to be mounting a full-size GPU, then your GPU is going to go down this way, right? And if that happens, then the use of this bracket over here for a storage drive is just not going to work anymore. Then your only option is going to be at the bottom of the case. So you are only going to be able to install two 2.5-inch storage drives here at the bottom of the case like this. Or you can try to install one more 2.5-inch drive behind the SFX power supply. Now back to GPU. If you're going to be using a full-size GPU, then your GPU is going to be sitting vertically down to the bottom of the case. And in that case, your HDMI and DisplayPort are going to be facing the bottom of the case. The case does come accompanied with a 90-degree HDMI cable, with the 90-degree DisplayPort cable being an add-on which you can purchase if you require. This is probably the only downside of this case as I may see it, because you will not be able to use your existing cables that you already have, as they will not bend comfortably in the space below and may not fit at all. Anyway, back to GPU. The Meshlicious does support up to 4 slots GPU, And in order to do that, you will have to manually adjust the middle spine, which is the middle piece, to cater for more space in the GPU half of the case by manually adjusting the spaces on the top and on the bottom of the case. If you are using a 3-slot GPU and intending to have the tempered glass panel on the side of the GPU to showcase your GPU, you may also like to do the same in order to give a larger breathing space on the side of your GPU. Lastly, for radiators, radiators go on the front of the case, right? On the front panel, that is where you lay your radiator for your AIO cooler. Otherwise, if you're not using AIO cooling, you could use it to place fans for your case. For fans and AIO radiators, this case supports up to 280 millimeters fan height. And there is an additional bracket pre-installed if you're using 240 millimeters or 220 millimeters fans. Now let's quickly get this case filled up and we can get going into exactly how delicious this Meshlicious is. So we've built up our PC. Here we've got a Gigabyte X570i Aorus Pro Wi-Fi for the motherboard, the Ryzen 7 3800 XT for the CPU, the Galaxy GeForce RTX 3080 for graphics card, 32GB 3600 MHz Corsair Vengeance Pro RAM cards, Cooler Masters V850 SFX power supply, the NZXT Kraken X62 for AIO Cooler, and for storage, we've got a Samsung Evo 970 NVMe SSD, as well as a Seagate Barracuda 3.5-inch hard drive. Through my experience in building this case, I've discovered several findings which I hope you will find useful for you if you have your eyes on this case as well and looking forward to getting one. So first of all, let's start with the motherboard. If you are using a Mini-ITX motherboard, which has a second NVMe M.2 SSD slot at the back of the motherboard which you intend to use, do note that due to the position of the motherboard, if you are using a full-size GPU which will stand vertically at the back of the case, this SSD will be sitting exposed without a heatsink right next to your GPU, which is not quite ideal as it can get quite hot in there given the tightness of the space. Now also on the motherboard, this case has a USB 3.1 Gen 2 port on the front panel at the top of the case, so you will need a motherboard with a compatible header for that to work. Here I'm using the Gigabyte X570i Aorus Pro Wi-Fi motherboard, and unfortunately given my other Mini-ITX motherboard, which is the Gigabyte B550i, both do not have the USB 3.1 Gen 2 port, so to avoid disappointment, do remember to check the specs of your motherboard. Otherwise, many motherboards these days comes with a USB Type-C port. It just means plugging into the back of the case instead of being able to leverage a port at the front top panel of the case. Lastly, on motherboard, if your motherboard has a PCIe 4.0 slot for your compatible GPU and you are intending to use the stock PCIe 3.0 riser cable that came with the case, instead of upgrading to the PCIe 4.0 riser cable which SSUPD does offer for sale, all is not lost as the PCIe slots are backwards compatible. What you do need to note is that you might want to set up your PC build outside of your case first, so that you can connect your graphics card directly to the motherboard and skip the 3.0 riser cable for a start, in order to boot up the PC, get to the BIOS and change the BIOS configuration for PCIe from Auto to Gen 3. Once that is done, you can then start fitting all the components back into the case and then connect the PCIe 3.0 riser cable to the motherboard and the GPU. The reason for connecting the GPU directly to the motherboard is so that you can boot up the PC and get to the BIOS. So if you had instead built the PC using the 3.0 riser cable straight away, it is highly likely that you end up booting up your PC with no signal to your monitor or get prompted that your graphic card is not being recognized. In any case, this is really quite simple to get done with for now, so try not to let the horror stories around riser cables intimidate you. In fact, for any new PC built with brand new components, my personal advice is always to build your PC outside of the case so that you can test every single component to ensure that they are working well without issues before getting into the case. Next up is power supply. So you can orientate your power supply to have the fans facing out or inwards, except that if you have it facing inwards, then the fan will just be blowing hot air back into the case, which is not quite ideal. Therefore, the way it should be is to be facing outwards. This placement is fine if you're using the mesh panel on the side, but if you are going to be using the tempered glass panel on this side, then it is something to think about, because the power supply is really sitting right at the edge of the case, which makes very little breathing gap between the power supply and the tempered glass panel if you're going to have it here. As we are using an SFX power supply in this build, we did manage to squeeze in a 3.5-inch hard drive standing horizontally behind the power supply on the spine of the case with a slight gap in between them. This is possible given that we did not shift the spine of the case. It still caters for a 3-slot GPU. If you were to look from the top of the case, you will still see that the motherboard half of the case has got slightly larger space than the GPU half. I was also still able to secure the hard drive with a single screw from the bottom of the case. However, what this means is that I have exhausted all the storage space available for 2.5-inch hard drives at the bottom of the case. Well, this setup for 3.5-inch hard drive was not proposed to be done this way. It wasn't in the manual. According to the manuals, we're supposed to use the storage bracket to be mounted below the graphics card only if you are using a shorter GPU. So far it's working smoothly, but I will continue to monitor the storage setup and update in the description of this video if I have any findings in time to come. Now moving on to GPU. Here we have the Galaxy GeForce RTX 3080, which is a 3-slot GPU. And once again, to emphasize, we did not adjust the spine of the case. It still caters for a 3-slot GPU. And given that, the GPU is really sitting almost right up to the edge of the case, which once again means that if you are going to be using the tempered glass panel on this side, there will not be too much breathing space between the GPU fans and the tempered glass. However, to note that given this is a 3-slot GPU, given I'm using a SFX power supply, if not for the 3.5-inch hard drive that I slotted behind the power supply, I could in fact choose to move the spine of the case closer towards the motherboard half of the case, such that the GPU half will have a larger space and therefore allow the GPU to sit backwards a little bit to create a little bit more space between the GPU itself and the tempered glass panel. Alternatively, you can simply just use the mesh panel on this side. Now, the Galaxy GeForce RTX 3080 is a relatively large graphic card, but it is not the largest. I have done a review on the Galaxy GeForce RTX 3080 previously, which you can find in my Gaming Gears playlist, where I showed a visual comparison of the size of several popular RTX 3080 graphics card. So if you are looking to use one of the RTX 3000 series graphics card, do take note of the space constraint for graphics card and ensure that you have one that fits. Well, I have not maxed out the full height of the graphics card yet. Apparently, the stands that hold it at the bottom, I could still move it down one notch further. But at this point in time, it is looking really snugly tall right to the top of the case. Next, we move on to AIO Cooler. Here I'm using an AIO Cooler from NZXT Kraken X62. And once again, if you are using an SFX power supply, you can go tubes down on this one. There are space behind the power supply to allow the tubes to be tucked behind the power supply, and therefore this arrangement actually works in this case. Now we've got fans set for exhausting here, since the graphics card's pulling air in and pushing them out from the side towards the fan. Lastly, let's talk about cable management. So I'm not very proud of my cable management, but in any case, this Meshlicious is an unexpected surprise, because given the way that I am just bundling and tugging away and closing panels, even with a build this compact where everything is almost snug together, and noted that the panels are push pins. So I was concerned that if the cables are not well done, you will not be able to push it in, and then the panels will then pop up. Surprisingly, the cable management turns out to be pretty effortless. So I was also a bit concerned about the fans on the radiator and the cables coming into contact with that. But once again, the SFX power supply helped with the situation because of the shorter cables that came along with it, and at the same time because of how small it is, therefore creating space beside it, space behind it for cables to be bundled and rested upon, which wouldn't have existed if I had used an ATX power supply. So overall, I would say thumbs up, great job well done to the Sun Side Up design team with the Meshlicious case. I can't say there are any adverse feedback I have as of now. My only setback is probably the fact that I need to get a new 90-degree DisplayPort cable, as the stock comes with a 90-degree HDMI cable. But the areas that the Meshlicious impressed me far outweighs this. So a few points from me. So firstly, we are looking at a vertical small form factor case. And if I were to look at the length of the footprint, probably just 1 foot long. And that's really, really cool. So you can now have a PC connected to your TV, sitting on the TV console, which you can use for Netflix, for gaming, for music, for home controls, without looking awkward at all. Secondly, the design of the Meshlicious to allow for accessibility into the case is very thorough, and the build is extremely enjoyable. I will, however, recommend to use the SFX power supply for this build, as it will open up a lot more options for you with the ability to restructure the space between the motherboard and the GPU. Especially if you have the tempered glass panel, or a larger GPU, or a need for additional storage drives, or simply just to treat yourself to an easier cable management. Third, the quality of the Meshlicious is really good. The frame is solid and sturdy. I didn't experience any peeling with the screwing and unscrewing. It may look like edges and corners, but there are no sharp edges at all. And lastly, at $119 US, I don't know what more to ask for. I think it is a very attractive and competitive price point for a mini ITX case of this nature. Not to forget that SSUPD is still a sister company of Lianli. The case is sold in variations. I personally prefer the full mesh design of the Meshlicious as compared to the tempered glass, since even with the mesh option, because of how fine the holes are, any RGB components you have within your build continues to show through the mesh panels, which I feel gives the case a very rustic yet cool, classy look, which I really like. All in all, I think this is really great case. I'd really like to hear from you. Tell me what you think, and if this might be, in your view, in the lineup for the best mini ITX case of 2021. Now, before you go, please do give us a like if you did enjoy this video, and do subscribe to our channel if you've not already done so. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.